Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then you do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjugation, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing, paid to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Well, good morning, church. Morning, church family, Rodney likes to say. We are a family. I have to tell you, as we get into this next chapter of Romans, this has been a chapter I've been eagerly anticipating and looking at, thinking, oh boy, I'm not sure how this one's going to go. There we go. Not sure how this one's going to go. You know, Romans chapter 13 is the challenge. Now, our lesson this morning follows Paul's Romans 12 instructions on service to God through the use of various gifts within the church, wherein we value and honor each other, each member of the body of Christ, loving one another radically without restraint. Believers receive the passionate call to guard against hate, to guard against and hate what is evil, cling to what is good. This is the simplified recipe for identifying and doing God's will and winning the day. We will recall that in this passage in Romans chapter 12 that Paul has laid out how believers are to love and give preference to one another with charity and brotherly love, perseverance, rejoicing in hope, and devotion in prayer. Believers are to engage the world around them, blessing and not cursing even their enemies, is sharing their hearts in empathy with their enemies' sorrows and rejoicing with them when they rejoice. When they're persecuted, believers do the will of God when they do not seek their own revenge, but rather they desire restoration for those who persecute and leave justice to be carried out according to God's sovereign authority. Paul goes through how believers in the kingdom of heaven in Romans 12, while still living in the old worldly kingdoms that will one day pass away, overcome evil with good. That's how he closes out Romans 12. They do this by living radically sanctified lives in service to God. And for the churches in Rome who were to be subjected to horrific and unjust persecution, as well as so many Christians to follow, questions would surely arise. Do you hear our cries, O God? How, O Lord, will your hand bring vengeance and justice to the land? And it is in Romans 13 that Paul gives us some insight into those questions. So let's get into that this morning. Turn with me in your text, because this is an exciting section. And it grinds at me a little bit. It's a little bit about myself. You know, I'm the kind of guy who, and there's probably, for a lot of us as Americans, we have liberty and freedom flowing through our veins. It's taught to us from the very early ages of our life that we live in a country that celebrates such liberty and freedom. And it was born out of a time hundreds of years ago that was really a time of revolution. And you can look into the beginnings of our story as a country, but when you do, what you will find is a great deal of honor that goes to God. In fact, if you look in our Declaration of Independence itself, you will see that nod and that acknowledgement that it is from authority that comes from above, that our forefathers, when they created that Declaration of Independence, those Bill of Rights and the Constitution, that they certainly had an acknowledgement of a higher authority in mind. So as we get into Romans 13, let's understand a little bit maybe where that came from, even in our own history. Should not grind at our desire, maybe as Americans, at the worldwide acknowledgement, and I would hope for everyone, for a desire for freedom. But there is still within that desire and acknowledgement of living in freedom, there is still a call within our Christian walk to be in submission to authority. Let's begin this morning in Romans chapter 13. We're going to begin in verses 1 and 2. It says this: every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those which exist are established by God, and therefore whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Now, the first point I want to really make about this is that God has ordained that every person be subject to governmental authority, because that authority comes down from God. Now, that idea, depending on, I'm not sure what version you read, it says that every person, not some people, not just you Christians, every person. But specifically, I want to focus in on that word person for a second, just to really lay home and drive home the point of how important this is. That word in the Greek is suke. It's one of the first words that I learned when I was studying Greek in college. It means soul. It means life. If you think about in terms of our culture, when we think and hear about maritime tragedies, when vessels go down, it's common for them to say, how many souls were lost? And when you think about it in those terms, it's not just a number. It's not just how many people. These were souls. These are people who no longer have a chance to make decisions between right and wrong anymore. They have gone to their resting place to await judgment. They are souls who are lost, and they will answer for the decisions they've made on this earth. They will either be covered by the blood of Christ and made righteous, or they will be judged and found unrighteous according to God's will and plan. So this word soul, suke, it really drives home the importance of the fact that we are not just a person subject to rulers and authorities on this earth. It is essential that not just our minds, but our souls be involved in subjection to authority. And that includes subjection to authority to government. That our souls should be involved in consideration when we hear the things that they are saying that we need to obey. That we should consider it, whether to honor it or not. Because it's important that for those that we live around, who are believers or not believers, that we live lives that are at peace and set a good example, because we bear the name Christian. We bear the name Christ. And we are being called to be in subjection to authority. And second of all, I want to say this, that Christians cannot and should not be indifferent. We should not be indifferent to ruling authorities over them. It is important to know what it is the civil authorities who have charge over us are calling and intending to call us to do. And we should consider it all the way down to our very soul. These are the things that are going to challenge us in what we may or may not need to obey. Does that put maybe just a little more important tone when we hear about quote unquote politics out there? Pay attention to what they're talking about. We are blessed to live in a country where we have choices. We do have the freedom to make our will known. And that is something that was based on our forefathers and their intention when they set forth the Constitution that they set in this country. And it's not that way everywhere and every place. And so we should take that in and let that soak in to our very soul, because these are the things that are going to challenge us and we're going to have to consider. Now, continuing on in verses 1 and 2. Second of all, I want to say this, that complete opposition to ruling authority for its own sake will never be ordained by God. That is to say, complete subjection to God's authority will always be honored by God. See the difference? Subjection to authority, to God's authority, will always be honored. See, God does not honor an anarchist's heart, and neither should his people. Buried within this, tucked within this, is not just the call to be in subjection to specific government, but it is to be in subject to authority itself. To not live a life or have a heart that seeks anarchy and unruliness. We should seek peace within our we should seek peace within our communities. And that takes a governing authority. That's the way that God has ordained this. And so to oppose governing authority is to oppose what God himself has ordained. And that cannot be honored. God may allow it. He may allow anarchy to exist for a time. And indeed, there have been times where there has been no rule. There are times, I think I'm going to come up on it. There are times when, in the Old Testament specifically, it talks about, even in Israel, there was no rule. And we know that within the world today, there are times where it is just back and forth warlords who carry on. And I suppose they carry on their own sense of ruling and authority, but in many ways, it is so self-serving. They are not really fulfilling the God-ordained function that they should be. Continue on verses 3 and 4. I want to say this, that God ordained the authority of government for the purpose of peace, liberty, security, and justice, by means of rule, reward, and wrath. Now, maybe you thought I was going to say peace, security, liberty, justice in the American way. It kind of feels like it should roll that way, but no, peace, liberty, security, justice. And he does this through rule, reward, and wrath. Listen to this, verses 3 and 4 of Romans chapter 13. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing. It is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. First, liberty. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16. 1 Peter 2, verse 16. See, we do have liberty. Even though we are subject to authority, we do have liberty. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16, and this is a parallel text to some degree of it's a parallel. What Peter is saying He's talking about the very same things that Paul is talking about. Peter says, act as free men and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. See, within that, he begins verse 13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king or as to one in authority. But we have freedom. He says, act as free men, but do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Paul sort of addresses this in Romans chapter 6, at the beginning of chapter 6, when he says, what shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may abound? Freedom from the law should never be an excuse to expand on grace, Paul says. We use our freedom, but we use it with responsibility and respect and honor to God. Should never be a covering for evil. Paul and Peter understand this. And for security, as I mentioned in the Old Testament, Judges 18:7. In Judges 18:7, there's mention of that there. Let's see. Judges. Oh, there we go. Okay, Judges 18:7, the priest said to them, go in peace your way in which you are going. The Lord has your approval. It says, then the men departed and came to Laish and saw the people who were in it living in security after the manner of Sidonians, quiet and secure, where there was no ruler humiliating them for anything in the land, and they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. See, there was no ruler that was doing humiliation at the time. There was no ruler who was unjust, who was humiliating. There is a time, see, that function of security is important for governing authorities to carry out the rule. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 10, we see the mention in Deuteronomy 10 as well. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 10, just a mention of this. It says, when you cross the Jordan and live in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you the rest from all your enemies around you, so that you live in security. So their enemies would be vanquished. It would be organized. They would be living under God's authority, carrying out his will, so that they would live in security. And justice. This is implied within the text of verses 3 and 4. The authority is that God gives and ordains is to carry out and measure and consider what the citizens are doing, whether it is for good or for evil, and to carry out punishment accordingly. He says, let's go back to this. He says, it is a minister of God. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. There's your reward. This is a minister of God for you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. It is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. There is the carrot. Take the carrot, avoid the stick. But is the government itself that bears the sword. It weighs and considers good and evil. Just as in Romans chapter 12, we as believers, the Roman church in Romans chapter 12 was encouraged to hate what is evil and cling to what is good. It implies that they must know it, that they must overcome it. And then there is a mandate for the governing authority to do the same, but in a larger way that oversees the community at large, to bring stability and security, and to carry out justice. And this brings peace. It's the carrot and the stick. Proverbs 13:24 says, in terms of parents, he who withholds the rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently. You know why that's so important? Do you know why that matters, parents? You must discipline your children. You want to discipline them there, in the home, in a loving, caring, firm, supportive way, so that your children will grow up understanding what it is to be under authority, to respect it, and understand that there is what is appropriate and what is right, and there is what is wrong. And when you disobey those things, when you step outside of those things, that there is carrot and there is stick. And if they don't learn that at a young age within the home, the carrot and the stick, especially the stick, changes to a sword. It changes from timeout in the corner to a prison cell. That is why it is so important to take discipline in a loving and caring and firm way with your children so seriously in the home. Take the carrot. As believers, Paul says, avoid the stick. You have nothing to fear. But I think we all kind of know that's not always the case, right? And even the Christians who were in Paul's day in Rome, we're going to find out that there was a great deal of injustice. I have a feeling that even when they received those letters, they knew there were times when there was injustice that happened. But that doesn't change Paul's overall instruction. So we're going to have to weave through that just a little bit more. Continuing on in verses 3 and 4, government exists in service to God to acknowledge and be at peace. With who? With those who are good citizens, and to acknowledge and carry out righteous wrath against those citizens who practice evil. You see, this is the more specific process that's being carried out from our earlier point. That as the government exists for the purpose of peace, liberty, security, and justice, and they do it through rule, reward, and wrath, how they do it is through acknowledging and being at peace with those who are good citizens, and acknowledging and carrying out wrath against those citizens who practice evil. That's really the justice part, isn't it? That's really the wrath part that comes. And they do that by establishing rule and law. These are all pretty basic things. And yet at the same time, again, knowing the kind of government under Rome, the Empire of Rome, and the level of suffering and persecution that they would go through, knowing the many years of persecution that many Christians would face throughout history, and even in places overseas where Christians are being persecuted today. This is a very difficult passage. Very difficult passage to understand, because they're looking at it and thinking, I don't see a government. I don't see an authority that seems so good, that seems so just and so right. But God calls us for patience. And we're going to have to weigh in a little bit. We're going to weigh into that just a little bit about how to work through that. First, I want to help us understand a little bit something in the wording here too. Paul uses the word for minister of God, that the authorities are a minister of God. That Greek word is diakonos. It's the same word we get for deacons in the church. Believe that? How about the next time you get pulled over for speeding and he writes you a ticket, and you think, why, thank you, sir. I appreciate your service to God. You are a true minister of God for, that. We don't, that sounds so weird to say. And yet at the same time, Paul wants us to take that to heart. That these are good people. Just last night, we had 3 officers from Skagit County Sheriff's Department here. And they were here meeting. We provided the space for them to talk to the community. And that opportunity was for them to be able to reach out and connect with those who have concerns about crime in the neighborhood and how they can help. And these men are men that we could sit here and listen to, people we could honor, because they're trying to do the service that God has placed on government to do. And we need to honor that. We need to be thankful for that. And it doesn't mean that there aren't times where people who wear those same kinds of uniforms and those badges do things that are wrong. And boy, do we see it on TV when it happens. It's on YouTube almost instantly. But at the same time, more often than not, they are servants for good. And they are doing great things. And they want more often than not to encounter people and be able to help them. I guarantee you there's many officers that would rather have the experience of trying to help restore, like we talked about in Romans chapter 12, those young people and those people who are in so much trouble that they run into out in the world. They would rather try and be a good influence if only they would listen, if they could. But sometimes they have to bear the sword. Sometimes they have to put them in jail instead. And even after that's the fact, one of the officers was talking about, just because we have to call something in and encounter something, report something, and maybe, people get in trouble, that doesn't mean that after that, that doesn't create it creates a situation where they then are on the radar to be able to be plugged into programs to try and get them help. But when communities don't call them and let them know what's happening that they see around them and just tell people to go away on their own, it doesn't get resolved. And so these guys, they are ministers of God in a way. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, 17 and 18, he says, respect what is right in the sight of all men. And if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. And that idea of respecting what is right in the sight of all men goes back to that understanding that what is right in the sight of all men usually flows into the way that the community is governed, and that flows into the way that justice is carried out. And we should strive to live within that and be at peace with that. And in Romans 19, he says, especially, and I love this, especially thinking back to verse 1, that it is our soul, every soul is to be in subject. He says in verse 19 of Romans chapter 12, leave room for the wrath of God. Where do you leave room for the wrath of God? In your heart, in your soul. Take it in. Understand that when you are persecuted, when you are wronged, leave space in there for God's justice, God's authority to be carried out. You don't take on justice for yourself. You leave space for the wrath of God. And that's what we're talking about today. That's how God carries it out. He has ordained an authority to do that in our governing authorities. And finally, verse 5 this morning. Verse 5 says, therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for the conscience sake. Not only for the sake of authority, but also for conscience sake. Now, I think, again, it's kind of like, okay, preacher, we don't have hearts of anarchy. We understand that we need to follow and obey the laws and all of that stuff. But again, it gets difficult, doesn't it? When the governing authority starts to look pretty oppressive. When the governing authority starts to challenge even the things that we know are against God's will. And that's where this comes into play. See, first Paul says, he says, therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, in other words, not only because of the wrath, not only because of the avenger, that is the governing authority, the one that bears the sword, but also for the sake of a conscience. See, our soul needs to be involved in understanding what the government, what the authorities are calling us to do or not do. We have to understand for ourselves whether to obey or not obey. Here's why. We cannot be in subjection to God and subjection to governing authorities when those two wills are in opposition. See, God has his authority, and governing authorities on earth are below. You get that? Big G will always trump little g. Right? When your Christian conscience tells you that service as a good citizen comes at the cost of not being a good Christian, you'll know you need to obey God rather than government. Now, if we think back, there's biblical example one after the next, after the next. In the Old Testament, we think of the midwives when they were ordered to slaughter the Hebrew babies that were being born. But what did they do instead? They hid them away, and including Moses. And so we have the story of the Exodus and the people of Israel being saved. And it goes on here. We have Esther, right? We have David in his own way resisting the authority of King Saul. When he runs away, it is a passive resistance. He flees from his presence so that he is not himself killed. But he does not strike back at Saul, does he? And instead, even when he has the opportunity to do so, just to show that he is still in subjection to God's authority, and even in subjection to Saul, he slices the corner of his cloak and leaves it as proof that he could have taken his life, but he is the anointed one that God has chosen, and he will not raise his hand against him. And David even goes so far when the news comes and he finds out from the messenger that he himself took Saul's life. He takes that messenger's life because he struck down the anointed of God. And we know from the New Testament, when Peter and John are called before the council in Jerusalem, they are told not to preach about this Jesus. And they are thankful when they come out. And they get out, and what do? They go right on preaching. They're not concerned whatsoever. In fact, that's in Acts chapter 4. Let's read that. That's such a great spot. It says, but when they had ordered them to leave the council, they began to confer with one another. So they listened to Peter and John. And they began to confer with one another, verse 16, saying, what shall we do with these men? For the fact that a noteworthy miracle has taken place through them is apparent to all who live in Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. These were men who were in authority. But so that it will not spread any further among the people, let us warn them to speak no longer to any man in this name. And they had summoned them, and they commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge. We cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. And when they had threatened them further, they let them go, finding no basis on which to punish them on account of the people, because they were all glorifying God for what had happened. You give example after example after example. Do you know, we even see this today, even within the last 3 or 4 years, within the Western culture and society, we have seen where governments have used excuses and made threats against churches to close their doors and not worship. And every Christian must examine their conscience. I cannot tell you what the right thing or wrong thing to do is specifically I'm not going to decide or listen to what any government in particular says, but we have to listen to our conscience and be aware of what our consciences are, so that when we are pressed and when we are challenged with a decision of whether or not to obey the government of men or to worship God or to obey God in the things that he calls us to do. You know, we are specifically instructed to gather together. And there are churches where they had chosen, no, we are going to continue doing this. We are not going to forsake the assembly of the saints based on their conscience. And then we've seen arrests. We've seen where churches stayed open in spite of the government orders not to do so. They gathered in assembly. And in contrast to that, those same governments, when there were large masses of people gathering in open areas where you could not have a protest based on something that was for the sake of a Christian belief, you could protest for things that were along certain ideologies that they were in approval of. They would shut one down and not the other. They would shut a church down, but they would leave a liquor store open. And so we began to see over the last 3-4 years that there are not always a balanced approach by the governing authorities. We must understand with our own consciences what it is we are to do. Who are we going to be in subjection to? And I don't take lightly when I hear the talk of civil war and things like that come up. It burns at me in my heart. I don't like it, because the matter of unrest and the level of usurpation to the authorities, the whole question of who is in charge gets thrown up in the air. And we as Christians must struggle with that. We've seen that already in the history of our country, where families were split apart, where one was on the blue side and one was on the gray side. And the only thing they had left was to appeal to God for blessing or not blessing, for who was to be in charge and who was to be in authority. And they had to go according to their own conscience. These are things that we should not long for. 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1-4 says, "First of all, then I urge that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made in behalf of all people, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and come to the acknowledgement of the truth." So that's that idea. Resistance that's not ordained by God will neither prevail nor go unpunished. It's not enough to be just in subjection to governing authorities, Paul says to Timothy. He says we need to pray for all men. Prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving made behalf of all people and for kings who are in authority. We should be praying for our leadership, not just for them to make good decisions, You notice it says God wants all people to be saved, to come to the knowledge of the truth. That's the best outcome that we can pray and hope for, is that our leadership comes to the knowledge of the truth, so that they too, above all, will be in subjection to the very one that we are in subjection to. So I close out this morning to say this. Where's your heart? Where's your soul? Have you let the things that God is calling you to really soak in? It's important to study this word and understand in every way, at the very lowest, at the very smallest level, what he calls you to in your life. So that when there are challenges, because there are governments and there are times where governments reach in and try to pluck at the very things that will be the specifics that you realize may be counter to what God calls you to do. And your soul must be ready to weigh in your own conscience. Is it right or is it wrong? Do I obey? Do I not obey? I'll give you one example that I think is great. Daniel. There's a period of 30 days where he's told, the whole kingdom is told, shall not pray anybody. Daniel goes into his upper room. What does he do? He doesn't go into his closet and pray quietly. He goes into his upper room. He opens his windows where everyone can see him. He does not hide his obedience. I think it's important as Christians that first we must be willing to be seen in disobedience when our conscience is plucked in such a way. That is to say that it gives a chance for those who are in authority to do the right thing. There are churches who, even in California of all places, tried to challenge churches that stayed open the entire time legally and lost. But they never showed up with the long arm of the law and forced them to close down. They never showed up and put their people in handcuffs and walked them away. There were places in Canada where that did happen. And I'm thankful that we didn't really see that here, that I'm aware of in the United States. The government has a heavenly long arm of the law. There's not that many places where you're going to be able to ever go and truly be out of reach of governing authority. You must learn to live with it, to love it, to honor it. The last two verses, 6 and 7 of Romans chapter 13, I think they really follow. And once your heart is broken in and your soul is broken in, they really follow. Jesus said it simply, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. If your conscience says, no, I can still honor God and do what they call me to do, render unto Caesar. Pay your taxes. Do the right thing. Obey the law. It's that simple. We are the people of God. We are Christians. We are called to obey. This morning, I want to end with this, and that is to say that if you have felt a calling to obey, but you have not given your life to Christ, there is no time like the present. There is always a time to step up, to acknowledge that you have not fully given over to his will in your life, to repent and be baptized. That is always an open invitation for you. If you need prayers, encouragement, we are here as a family. If we could surround you as a whole, or if you need to speak with leadership in private or someone in private, don't waste the time that we have come together today in fellowship or afterwards. Do that. That is always something that we are loving and caring and hoping to do for anyone who is hurting. And let's consider that as you stand and sing this morning our song.